All right, it's 101. I think we can get started. I'm trying to stall a little bit because there's a few people that we're probably still waiting on. And forgive me while I just quickly check my email to see if anybody has sent me a message. Nope, we're good. Okay. So welcome to our program today. Thank you for joining us for Roebling Road Trip. Roebling Road Trip is a program we've been doing for a few months now. It was absolutely born out of the coronavirus pandemic, but I'm thinking it's a really good thing anyway, because many of us wouldn't be able to travel all across basically the eastern seaboard so far, but we're willing to go further. If maybe we should do one on the Golden Gate Bridge. But this basically brings you across the country to different sites that have a connection to Roebling history. And most of them so far have been John A. Roebling specifically, which we will be continuing today as we learn about Allegheny Portage. Just because I know you're all thinking about it, our next Roebling road trip in December is going to be with the Delaware and Hudson Canal Museum. They have some serious Roebling history to talk about there. So keep an eye on your emails. There will be information about that coming soon as we finalize the date on that. So for those of you who haven't met me yet, because I started right before the pandemic, my name is Lynn. I'm the executive director at Roebling Museum. And if any of you don't actually know about the Roebling Museum yet, our museum is located in a company town known as Roebling, New Jersey, which was built by the Roebling Company, which was founded by the Roebling family. I say Roebling a lot in this role. So we are located in central New Jersey in Burlington County, right on the Delaware River. And we are kind of right at the edge of the company town. And the company town was built in 1905 and remains almost fully intact architecturally. Our museum is on the site of the former factory. So our building is actually the gateway the workers used to walk through to get to the factory buildings. And we have indoor and outdoor exhibits that bring to life the story of the people who lived in the company town, as well as the big impact that the Roebling family and the Roebling Company had. So I just want to give a little bit of an overview of how today's program is going to run. Our guests from the National Park Service, they're going to be giving an illustrated lecture. Then, a lot of times with programs, you're supposed to hold your questions to the end. But if you have questions, just type them into the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, because as soon as you think them, type them, because I'm going to be secretly behind the scenes gathering those together so that once the talk is over, I'll start asking those questions to Elizabeth and Doug. And I will also be keeping an eye on the time so that we don't go over an hour today. And I think that's all I really have to say. So let's all welcome Doug and Elizabeth.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks for having us on the Roebling road trip today, and see if our technology works. I am about to share my screen, so we'll see how that works. And can everybody see my screen?
Looks good.
All right. Well, we're here on the Roebling road trip, so you all know that by now. Let me advance here. And you already heard a little bit about us here at Allegheny Portage Railroad. You'll hear more about the park at the very end, so you don't need to see our names anymore, and I will turn things over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Lynn, for having us be part of the Roebling road trip today. So first, I'm just going to go over what we will be talking about today. So we will be talking about the main line canal and how the Allegheny Portage Railroad fits in with the main line canal. And also, because we're talking about Roebling, we will be talking about how John A. Roebling fit in with the mainline canal and the Allegheny Portage Railroad. And then at the end of our presentation, we will be giving an overview of our park, Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site. So first we will start with the main line of public work. So setting the stage for the mainline canal. In New York State, you have the Erie Canal that opens in the mid 1820s. And there was concern by many people that Philadelphia as a port city was going to be bypassed. People were also afraid that Pittsburgh was going to be losing money from being a Western depot. So the state of Pennsylvania came up with a solution to keep these big cities in Pennsylvania thriving. And as a result, a lot of towns across the state growing because of the mainline canal. So its official name was the Main Line of Public Works, was also referred to as the Mainline Canal or simply the Main Line. It was built and operated by the state of Pennsylvania and cost $12 million. Construction began in Harrisburg in 1826 and was complete in 1834 with the opening of the Allegheny Portage Railroad. This system, the main line, stretched nearly 400 miles across the state. Prior to the mainline canal, it took about 3 weeks to travel across the state, various wagon roads. With the mainline canal, it now took about 5 to 7 days. So this was the fast new way to travel. From Pittsburgh being sent east, you had raw materials, coal, iron ore. Coming from Philadelphia being sent out west, you had manufactured goods. And canals during this time period were the preferred method of travel, but the topography of Pennsylvania did not allow for an all canal route across the state. So we'll be talking about the different sections of the mainline canal. Was comprised of railroads, canals, and inclined planes. So the mainline canal, fast, new, easy way to travel, cost effective, not only for shipping goods across the state, but also for the movement of people. And this system was in use until the mid 1850s, when the Pennsylvania Railroad will lay an all railroad line across the state. And now it's possible to travel across the state of Pennsylvania in one day, excuse me. So we'll be starting in Philadelphia and working our way across the state, just briefly touching on the different sections of the mainline canal. First, you have the Columbia and Philadelphia Railroad, which was 82 miles in length, started in Philadelphia and went to the Susquehanna River. It did have an inclined plane at each end to get up out of the river valleys, and this portion took about 6 hours. Next was the eastern division of the canal. This part was a canal section. It was 43 miles from the eastern bank of the Susquehanna River in Columbia to Clark's Ferry and Duncan's Island. This section contained 14 locks and took about 18 hours. The Juniata division, also a canal section, ran from the Susquehanna, ran to Hollidaysburg. The elevation change on this section was significantly higher at 6,500 feet. So a lot more locks were required on this section of the mainline canal. So you had 86 here, and it took about 60 hours. From Hollidaysburg up over the Allegheny Mountains to Johnstown, you had the Allegheny Portage Railroad. It was 36 miles, and it consisted of 11 level sections and 10 inclined planes. And in a little bit, I'll be talking in more detail about the Allegheny Portage Railroad and how that worked. But it took about 6 hours to get up over the Allegheny Mountains. And then finally, you have from Johnstown, the western division of the canal, which was 105 miles from Johnstown to Pittsburgh. And this section took about 50 hours.
And now a little bit about canals, because we're not too familiar with those anymore. We haven't used them as a regular mode of transportation for quite a bit. So since this system, this Pennsylvania main line of public works, was made up of a large portion of canals, just some basics. So the canal is basically a man-made river. The ditch of the canal is usually called the prism. And on the Pennsylvania Canal, it was 40 feet wide at the top and 28 feet wide at the bottom. It was 6 feet deep and had 4 feet of water in that to float the boats, and the boats could pass in there to have two-way travel. And then the one side of the canal had a tow path where the horses and mules would walk, pulling the canal boats along the canal. Elizabeth mentioned about the quite significant change in elevation on the canal. On a canal, you want the water to stay a still pool, basically. You can't have it running or flowing like a river, because it's one of the points of having a canal is to be able to have two-way traffic on the canal. So you want a nice even body of water. So to keep those sections of water even and level, you need locks to go uphill or downhill on a canal. And the entire Pennsylvania Canal has 168 locks, and you usually need a lock about every 8 to 10 feet in elevation change on the canal. And simply the boats go through one set of gates in a lock and are either raised or lowered by letting water in or out of that chamber, and then they are allowed to continue on. Sometimes that process can take up to 10 or 15 minutes each time a boat is going through a lock. And so that is can be a significant bottleneck on the canal. Each time a boat can only take one boat through a lock at a time, and traffic jams would build up at the lock. So one of the, there are a lot of good things about canals, but the delays at the locks were not so good, really slowed things down. These boats on the canal were pulled by animal power, horses or mules, usually mules. The mules would pull the boats anywhere from 3 to 4 miles per hour. There were experiments using steam-powered boats on the canals. You think, why, make them go a little bit faster than 3 or 4 miles per hour, but they found that any faster than about 4 miles per hour, and the wake from the boat will erode the banks of the canal. So since you can't go any faster than 4 miles an hour anyway, it was pointless to mess around with a steam-powered boat. Just keep using the horses and mules. And a mule, for anybody out there that is wondering, is a hybrid animal. It's a hybrid of a male donkey and a female horse. And they usually use mules compared to horses because the mules could pull a little bit more for their size compared to a horse. They are very durable. They would also not allow themselves to be overworked on the canal, where a horse, you could drive it until it basically was useless and could actually cause harm to the animal. A mule will say enough and not work anymore, and then you'll switch it out with another mule. The types of boats that were used on the canal, several types. The most common boat was a freight boat, because most of what was moving on the canal was freight. Just like if you watch a modern railroad today, most of what you're going to see are freight trains versus passenger trains. So same on the canal, a lot of cargo being carried, hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo every year. The freight boats, the size of them was 80 feet long, 14 feet wide. That was dictated by the size of the locks, which were 90 feet long and 15 feet wide. And these freight boats could carry 30 to 50 tons or even more tons of cargo. And they could be pulled along at about 2 to 3 miles per hour because of their weight. Next type of boat, which we could relate more to, because this is the type of boat that people rode in beyond just the crew of the boat. It's called a packet boat. These were the passenger boats on the canal. You can see the figures there. They were a little bit narrower than a freight boat. They were 12 feet wide versus 14 feet wide. So they could slice through the water much faster, up to 4 miles per hour instead of the 2 to 3 miles per hour of a freight boat. Could, whip along the canal at 3.5 to 4 miles per hour. And inside the packet boat, there could be anywhere from 30 to 100 passengers jammed inside of there. And the term packet boat, that means a boat that runs on a set schedule. And the term originated in boats that would carry the U.S. mail, and they bundled the mail into packets with twine. And so that's where the term came from. Most of the time they didn't carry mail on the canal boats anymore, but the term stuck around for meaning a boat that runs on a set schedule. So passengers would know when to get on when the boat was leaving. Cargo boats usually only moved once they had a full load of cargo, so they didn't necessarily run on a set schedule. And then the probably the most interesting type of boat used on the Pennsylvania Main Line Canal was the sectional or portable boat. And that because it could be broken into sections, and then the sections lifted onto flat cars and carried on the railroad. And the benefit of these was that when the cargo in the boat got to the railroad, it could just stay in the boat for the trip. A regular freight boat, everything had to be unloaded when it got to the railroad sections of this system. And then once the cargo got to the end of the railroad, it had to be unloaded again into another canal boat. And that really wasted a lot of time. So they quickly thought of these sectional boats because they thought of these after the whole system had been built. They only used these about 20% of the time because there are already all these other boats in use. And then another reason they didn't use these, also related to them not thinking of these until the system had already been built, is that these were narrower than a regular boat, so they could fit on the railroad. These were only about 8 feet wide versus 14 feet wide for a regular boat, so they couldn't carry as much cargo. But some shipping companies liked these because of the speed, because you didn't have to load and unload them at each point on the system where you went from canal to railroad or railroad to canal. And we talk about them a lot in the park. They're in our park movie, they're in our exhibits, and they were talked about at the time a lot. They're talked about today just because they're so darn neat. A boat that goes onto a train. I mean, it's still grabbing our attention today. So that's why a lot of times you'll get the perception that this is the only type of boat that was used on the Pennsylvania Canal, when actually there were other types, and they didn't use this one quite as much because they just didn't think of it in time. And back to you, Elizabeth, for a little bit more information on the Allegheny Portage Railroad itself.
Thank you, Doug. So since canals were the preferred method of travel during this time, a railroad was not the first idea to conquer the Allegheny Mountains. Railroads were very much in their infancy here at that time. So the state did come up with a few other ideas. One of those was a 4-mile long canal tunnel. That was not practical. One estimate said it could take 30 years to build. The state didn't have that much time to figure out how to get over the Allegheny Mountains. Another idea that was tossed around was a wagon road, but there already was a turnpike wagon road that went over the Allegheny Mountains, and that was not really practical either. So workers began digging now on both ends with the hope that by the time they got to the Allegheny Mountains, there would be a solution. And the solution was an inclined railroad that connected two canal basins in Hollidaysburg and Johnstown. It was made up of 11 level sections and 10 inclined planes. And there were 5 on each side of the Allegheny Mountains that sort of served as a staircase on each side of the mountain to be able to get people and goods over the mountains. steam locomotives at this time did not have enough power to go up over the mountains themselves. So that is why you needed those inclined planes. Crossing the Allegheny Mountains was not an easy task. In the early 1830s, the summit of the Allegheny Mountains sits at about 2,400 feet above sea level. So the Allegheny Portage Railroad was the first railroad to cross the Allegheny Mountains. The word portage means the carrying of a boat or its cargo between two navigable waters. The railroad opened March 18th, 1834. Its first run over the mountain had 8 freight cars with 10 tons of bacon. The Ebensburg Sky newspaper, a few days after the opening of the Allegheny Portage Railroad in 1834, stated that the most important link in the chain of communications was fully united to the other part. So thus, with the opening of the Allegheny Portage Railroad, you have that final link to the mainline canal, and now you are able to travel the whole system from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. On the level sections, you did have locomotives. They could only run during this time on nearly level ground. During the first year of the railroad's operation in 1834, on the level sections, you used animal power, horses. Starting in 1835, you started to incorporate the use of steam locomotives. The first one that was used was called the Boston, and it got its name from where it was made. And newspapers of the day said that there were crowds of people at the Johnstown Canal Basin when the locomotive came. Everyone turned out to see it. And it ran back and forth between planes 1 and 2. So after that, you slowly start to incorporate the use of steam locomotives. So it wasn't all at once. So animal power would still have been used on the level sections where there were not steam locomotives. And Doug had mentioned about top speeds earlier on the canal. For locomotives, you could not exceed 18 miles per hour. So this was a lot faster than traveling in the canal. The Board of Canal Commissioners would set speed limits. 18 miles an hour may seem a little bit slow to us today, but back then, again, this is the fast way to travel. A few years ago who have an account of an ancestor that rode on the Allegheny Portage Railroad, and they said that traveling on the level sections seemed so fast that the family wasn't able to pick out individual trees. It was like they all blurred together. Also in May of 1839, Ulysses S. Grant would ride over the Allegheny Mountains. He had just turned 18. He was heading to the military academy at West Point, and describing his travels on the level sections at top speed, he said that this seemed like annihilating space. So for people traveling at those speeds, perhaps for the first time, it would have been very fast. And here we have a picture of an engine house structure. There would have been one of these engine house buildings at the top of each inclined plane. And inside of the engine house building was a stationary steam engine. So again, because locomotives did not have enough power to go up over the mountains themselves, this stationary engine provided the power to do so. This stationary engine pulled an endless loop of hemp rope and cars up the incline. Machinery for the engine house would have been down inside the pit of the structure. So how it worked was, at the bottom of the inclines, you had men called hitchers who would hook up the cars to the hemp ropes, and you would be pulled by stationary engine that had 35 horsepower. Once you got through the engine house, you would then be pulled by animal power on the levels or steam locomotives, And then when you get to the next incline, you hook back up to the rope and you're pulled by stationary engine. So you would repeat that process through all 11 levels and 10 incline planes. So the ropes that were used on the Allegheny Portage Railroad were made of Italian and Russian hemp. They varied in length between over 3,000 feet to over 6,000 feet in length, and on average were between 6 to 7 inches in circumference. Rope makers on the Allegheny Portage Railroad, depending on what your particular job was, you made a little over $1 to $2 per day, depending on if you were principal rope maker, assistant, what your job was. On average, the hemp rope used on the Portage Railroad lasted 16 months, 1 season. If it was constantly wearing out, rope was always in need of repair due to rotting or snapping. The railroad spent a large amount of money per year on rope. Before the railroad opened, the ropes that were used on the Allegheny Portage Railroad, 10 ropes, 1 for each inclined plane, plus 2 extra, cost $20,000. So in today's dollars, that's over $620,000 for 1 set of rope and a few extra pieces. As stated in the 1839 Canal Commissioner's report, upon 3 of the planes, new ropes have been placed. 5 other sets were prepared, and that they were planning by the next spring that the other 2 would need replaced. So this is a large amount of money that's being spent every year to maintain these ropes. It was even suggested that the possibility of building a roof over the inclines to protect that rope from breaking and trying to save money. During the winter, when the railroad was not in operation, all of the rope was taken up and stored locally. Lots of accidents caused by these hemp ropes breaking. You're traveling up the inclined plane, the rope snaps, the cars go barreling backwards. So people, major injuries, deaths, workers, travelers on the Portage Railroad because of those ropes breaking. There was one solution called a safety car. It was served as a brake that was attached to the last car going up the hill, with the hopes that if the ropes broke, the cars would catch on that safety brake and be stopped. It worked well when it was in place, but sometimes men were in a hurry and to save time decided not to attach the safety car. So very dangerous with those hemp ropes breaking, and a safer solution was needed, and that is where John Roebling comes into the story.
Yes, and finally, how does this guy fit into all of this story that we've been telling so far? Mr. Roebling. If you took part in an earlier Roebling road trip, you heard about the Roeblings in Saxonburg, first in Mulehausen in Prussia, and then in Saxonburg. So I won't go into too much of the detail there. So we'll kind of pick them up when they are in Saxonburg in Butler County in Western Pennsylvania. John A. Roebling and his brother Carl had come from Mulehausen, Prussia in the early 1830s with other people from the community, and were hoping to establish a thriving community in Western Pennsylvania. The people in the community, including the Roeblings, were trying different things out to make this a thriving community. They tried farming, they tried raising cattle and sheep. None of that worked. Wasn't the best place for farming. They had a failed dye works. They tried raising silkworms. That didn't work. Canaries, that didn't work. Things really came to a head in 1837. Some things happened that really impacted John A. Roebling's life. One thing in the positive, his firstborn child, Washington A. Roebling, was born in 1837. And then some bad things happened. His brother Carl died in 1837. And then the Panic of 1837 started, this huge economic depression that swept over the country. Mr. Roebling, John Roebling, needed to find something to do, so he went back to work as an engineer and surveyor, which he had trained in back in Prussia. That was his occupation there before he came to America. There were lots of canals and railroads being built in America at the time, so he went to work for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as a surveyor. And he was traveling back and forth, working on these various canals and railroads. It was providing income where these other attempted occupations in Saxonburg had failed. And it also was helping to, potentially, maybe get some of this transportation to Saxonburg itself. So in traveling across the state, Roebling traveled on the canal and the Allegheny Portage Railroad, and he was noticing these hemp ropes and how quickly they were wearing out, how often they needed replaced. He was even around just after there were some accidents when that rope was breaking. So this got his wheels turning. Is there a better way to do this? And he had heard about experiments in Europe on making wire rope. So he decided, well, maybe this is something that could work on the Portage Railroad to replace that hemp rope. He started thinking also that it would be something good for Saxonburg. If he could figure out a way to make wire rope, it would be something that the community could take part in making and maybe turn this into the thriving community that he had imagined. And it would also help him in that the surveying that he was doing was very seasonal work. So he wasn't working year round. So if he could at least make some wire rope the other parts of the year, that would benefit him and his community. In traveling across the state of Pennsylvania doing these surveys, he kept extensive engineering notebooks and threw on some photos of those notebooks. These are his original notebooks that he used in these surveys in Western Pennsylvania, and they are part of the collection at the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh. So those hemp ropes Elizabeth talked about a little bit, they didn't last very long. They are out in the weather, were always wearing out and breaking. And so John Roebling was trying to figure out a way to replace these with wire rope. He didn't know much more about the wire rope being experimented on than what he read in journals. So he basically set his mind to figuring out how to make wire rope. And he wanted to try it out. He didn't try it out at first on one of those 10 incline planes on the Allegheny Portage Railroad, but there were smaller incline planes where it would be able to be tried out at where the railroad met up with the canal at each end. In Hollidaysburg and Johnstown, there was a very small incline plane where those sectional canal boats were raised and lowered out of the water. Roebling was friends with the superintendent of the Portage Railroad, a man named John Snodgrass, and he asked him his idea and said, basically, can I try this out? And to try out a small piece, a few hundred feet long, they said, go for it. In 1841, Roebling handmade in Saxonburg a several 100-foot long wire rope to try out on the Johnstown boat plane, and it was installed and they tried it out, and it was an utter failure. So what went wrong? Big reason it failed is that it was a parallel wire rope. It wasn't a twisted wire rope. It was a wire rope like is used on bridges, on many bridges, which works fine for being stationary, but a parallel wire rope doesn't do well when it's put into motion. The outer wrapping wears away and then the insides fall apart like a bunch of spaghetti. There have been reports too that the rope was sabotaged, but I haven't found any conclusive evidence. Basically, and Washington Roebling even says in his autobiography that the reason it failed was it was parallel rope. So John Roebling went back to the drawing board basically and decided, well, it works for regular hemp rope to twist it. Just twist the wire for the wire rope. And that is exactly what he did. twisted it. There were 7 strands, or sometimes it's called 6 strands around a center core. Each of the 7 strands had 19 wires in each. The wire rope was made about 1 3/8 to 1 7/16 inches in diameter, depending on which inclined plane it was used on. So once he decided to twist the rope, they tried it out again on the boat plane in Johnstown, and it did work, didn't fall apart. So next, he wanted to try it out on one of the actual inclined planes themselves. And he chose plane number 3 to try it out on. And the deal was that if it worked, the state would pay him for it. And if it didn't, it was on him. So he put it on at his expense. And again, this was on inclined plane number 3. And I'll throw this out there. Maybe somebody can answer this for me at the end. Why do you think out of the 10 inclined planes, John Roebling chose inclined plane number 3? Out of all 10, he picked number 3 for a very specific reason. We'll see if anybody can guess that in the question and answers. When they did place it on number 3, it did work very well after some tinkering, because it wasn't quite as large in diameter. All the wheels and shivs that it went through, it would slip. So they redesigned those. Once they did that, it worked just fine. And then the state began replacing the hemp ropes on the other inclined planes with wire rope. And all of the wire rope was replaced all the wire rope was placed on the Portage Railroad by 1849, replacing all of the hemp ropes. So because of this success, John A. Roebling in Saxonburg was now in the wire rope business. That doesn't quite end the story on the main line. He had another large project on the main line canal system, and that was in Pittsburgh. There was a large aqueduct, basically a bridge full of water to carry boats. And it ran from one bank of the Allegheny River to the other. And in the winter of 1844, a large ice flow that broke up destroyed the aqueduct, and it needed replacement. And so John Roebling was encouraged to put in a bid to replace it, but replace it with a suspension bridge. Basically, before it was destroyed by ice, this aqueduct was like a large covered bridge with a trough of water inside. And so it was proposed by Roebling to replace it with a suspension aqueduct. And people thought at the time, the idea was crazy enough, but people in the main line knew Roebling, and they knew his success with the wire rope on the inclined planes. So because of that, they did give him a chance. They did give him the contract to replace the Allegheny Aqueduct. He started rebuilding it later on in 1844. And it was in 7 spans over the Allegheny River, 162 feet each, and suspended by his wire rope. And it was a success. It was used for the rest of the time that the canal was used in Pittsburgh up into the 1860s. And just to give a sense exactly what it looked like, it is very similar in design to the aqueduct over the Delaware River on the Delaware and Hudson Canal. A few less spans, but the design was the same. And the one over the Delaware River, which was started in 1847 and completed in 1849 for the D&H Canal. And it is still there today. And you can actually drive through it now. It doesn't hold water on a canal anymore, but you can drive your car across it. It was restored by the National Park Service in the early 2000s. So if you picture that in Pittsburgh with a few more spans, that's exactly what it looked like. And because of this success, building this aqueduct, this suspension aqueduct in Pittsburgh, that turned Roebling into a bridge builder in addition to being a wire rope maker. So that really set him up for future success. Made a lot of wire rope and built quite a few more bridges, as we also heard in an earlier Roebling road trip. So that sums up the story of the things that John A. Roebling did for the Pennsylvania Main Line of Public Works with the wire rope on the inclined planes of the Portage Railroad, and then the Pittsburgh or Allegheny Aqueduct to get across the Allegheny River in Pittsburgh. So I will turn things back over to Ranger Elizabeth for a little bit about our park here at Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site.
We hope that one day you're able to visit the sites featured in the Roebling road trip, and that your journey will bring you here to Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site. We are located in Gallitzin, Pennsylvania, which is about 5 hours from Roebling, New Jersey. Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site is part of the National Parks of Western Pennsylvania. So lots of national parks for you to visit here in the area, including Johnstown Flood National Memorial, Flight 93 National Memorial, Fort Necessity National Battlefield, and Friendship Hill National Historic Site. Here are some of our park buildings that we have here. So our park is located at the summit of the Allegheny Mountains. So in the first picture is our summit level visitor center. It opened in 1992. Next to that is the Lemon House Tavern that was built in the early 1830s by Sam and Jean Lemon. And this was the only building that was on site when we became part of the National Park Service in the 1960s. So the Lemon House served as a visitor center for the park for a number of years before the summit level visitor center opened in 1992. On the bottom, we have the Engine House 6 exhibit shelter. So it gives an idea of what the engine house structures would have looked like on the Allegheny Portage Railroad. The original engine house number 6 was torn down around 1900 when it had fallen into disrepair. Our exhibit shelter is a bit bigger than the engine house structures would have originally been, and that's because of the stone foundation, the original foundation on the inside. Also on the inside is some reconstructed machinery, stationary engine, sheaves, all kinds of machinery that show how everything was pulled up the inclined planes. And on the bottom right, we have the Staple Bend Tunnel, which was the first railroad tunnel in America. And unlike the last 3 pictures that are all part of our main park unit in Gallitzin, the Staple Bend Tunnel was at the top of inclined plane number 1. So it is closer to Johnstown, but you can walk. It's a little over 2 miles each way. You can go through the tunnel. It's 901 feet long, hiking or biking. And it's also part of the path of the Johnstown Flood Trail as well. And since the Lemon House was the first, or excuse me, the only building on site when we became part of the National Park Service, a lot of the exhibit panels that were in the Lemon House moved into the Summit Level Visitor Center when it opened in the early 90s. So we recently got all new exhibits installed in our visitor center, and we have some pictures to share with you of the inside. We have a replica canal boat, which you can go inside, which is one of our favorite features of the new visitor center. We have next at the top a picture of our front desk, which was made to look like a desk at a shipping office. The next picture on the bottom shows our section on the house and how that whole aspect fit into the Allegheny Portage Railroad. And on the bottom right, we have some models, many of those including the machinery in our engine house. It was all made by a man that lived in the local area that actually grew up in the Lemon House as a child. So we're very lucky to have those models. They show packet boats and section boats. We also, not just about the Allegheny Portage Railroad in our visitor center, but also the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal. So we have a section on Philadelphia, a section on Pittsburgh. We also have a section on the Underground Railroad where you can learn how the Allegheny Portage Railroad aided people looking for freedom in the north, and a photo of our bookstore at the bottom there. And thank you again to Lynn and the Roebling Museum for having us be part of the Roebling road trip today. And we hope to see you in the future at our park. Right now, due to COVID-19, our visitor center is the only building on site that is open to the public. So right now, the Engine House, 6 Exhibit Shelter, and the Lemon House Tavern are currently closed to the public. Thank you, Lynn.
Yes, thank you, Lynn.
Thank you so much. That was such a good presentation. I explained this to our presenters earlier when we were chatting, but I've secretly been using Roebling Road Trip to learn about Roebling's impact. So this has been a really fun time just for me. I'm just learning so much. I think the first thing we should do before we get into questions is there's lots of people who are guessing about the plane 3, incline number 3. Some people asked if it was the steepest, was it closest to the site of rope construction? What's the real answer?
So the clue was that it was at Roebling fence at first. So he chose the shortest of the 10 incline planes. So it would be a shorter walk rope and less material, so less expense for him should it not actually work, and he'd have to pocket it. You'd have to take in that expense entirely. Now, it did work, so the state paid him for it, but that risk that was involved there, so he picked the shortest of the 10 incline planes, which was number 3.
Smart guy. Okay, so we have another question, and this was not so much about the pulling up, but the descent. Was that run by steam power or gravity or something else?
So on the inclined planes, it was preferred to have one set of cars that's coming up. So you can have one that's going down, so it sort of worked as a counterbalance, but gravity would kick in as well. So, and that's one of the reasons that the Lemon House Tavern sits at the top of the incline. There would have been some sort of tavern or rest area, because things could get quite backed up at the inclines if there are accidents. If you're ready to descend and you're waiting for something to come up, you may have various reasons for delays.
And if the weight going down was a little bit more than what was coming up, then gravity did take over the work and would actually do most of the work of pulling the load up the other side. And in some cases, they didn't even need to use the stationary steam engine in the engine house at all.
That's great. Yeah, hearing you guys describe it, it just makes me think of all the parts of a roller coaster that terrify me. So I'm glad that I missed this experience.
Very low speed roller coaster, unless something bad happened, then.
Yeah. And that's exactly how I picture it as well. You know, you're kind of slowly inching up the incline plane to the top, hoping like the ropes don't break or you don't get, so that anticipation of reaching the top of the incline plane.
It's an early roller coaster. Okay. So another question is, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, I absolutely promise. What is the difference between an incline plane and a funicular?
Not really a whole lot of difference. Usually funicular is a little bit smaller scale, just carrying passengers. We have one that's called a funicular nearby here at the Horseshoe Curve National Historic Landmark that takes people up to a railroad viewing area. They're pretty much two different names for the same thing.
Did John A. Roebling make wire rope for all 10 inclines?
Yes. But some other companies got into competition, and later in the 1840s and into the 1850s, other companies won some of the contracts. But at one time or another, John A. Roebling made rope for all 10 planes.
Did Roebling have anything to do with the inclined railroad in Pittsburgh?
Not 100% sure. He wasn't
Either.
involved in building them or anything. I'm guessing at one time or another, probably the wire rope on those inclines in Pittsburgh, especially in the 19th century, they probably used Roebling wire rope. Roebling, John A. Roebling Sons being the top manufacturer. That's just a guess on my part.
Did Roebling's wire rope ever break or cause injuries, death like the hemp rope did?
Not as much, but it did sometimes break. It did have a lifespan. It was longer than the hemp rope, but it did have, it would eventually wear out. So sometimes it did just, but sometimes the area where it would break is the splice, because it's an endless loop of rope. So it's one piece of rope that is put into a loop shape, but then it has to be spliced together, and that splice would always be a weak point. So sometimes the splice would be the place where it did break. And then especially early on when they were using the wire rope, they had some issues with attaching the rail cars to the rope. It was easier to do on the hemp rope because the hemp rope would give some and allow the attachment to dig into it and hold it faster, where, you know, wire rope's pretty hard and slippery. And so there was troubles early on with whatever they attached to the rope would slip off and go sailing down the plane. But once they figured out a better way of attaching, they didn't have that problem. So there were accidents, but not nearly as many as when they were using the hemp rope.
All right, we're going to close out. Last question with what has been indicated to me is a serious nerd question. So get ready. Why does parallel wire work for bridges, but not for the inclined planes?
Works for bridges because it's stationary, other than just expanding and contracting, or, you know, giving the load on the bridge. It's just hanging out there. But rope used on, say, one of the inclined planes is always moving. It's being wrapped around various wheels and pulleys and everything. So there's a lot of wear that is involved. And the parallel wire rope is simply that. The wires, a bunch of wires are parallel, and to kind of keep them all together, there's another wire that's wrapped around the outside, and it's called serving. And, you know, when it's not moving, that serving is going to stay there. But if you put that in motion and have it going through all those wheels and pulleys, those wires on the outside will wear away, and then there's nothing to hold the insides together other than the tension that it's under, and that will not always do the job. So and then the wires inside will start wearing a little bit, and it loses strength and it will fall apart. But when it's just hanging out on a bridge, it does just fine.
Sorry, I'm trying to read to see if there's another question because of lots of stuff. Okay, one last question because we do have about 5 more minutes. Is there anything left to see of the first canal bridge that was destroyed by ice and was rebuilt?
No. You
No.
can go to its location in Pittsburgh. There's a historical marker there, but the traces of the bridge or its abutments, either version, are gone. There's a large railroad bridge there today that's almost in the same place because the Pennsylvania Railroad ended up buying the mainline canal from the state of Pennsylvania and then used the canal as railroad right-of-way. So a bridge ended up being put in the same place. So you can get an idea of the location where that was in Pittsburgh, but there's absolutely nothing left of it.
Well, that's great. I think we got to most of the questions. A lot of the questions that I had, y'all actually answered during your presentation. So although I took a lot of notes, you answered them. So that's the sign of a good presentation. And some folks in the questions and comments are also appreciative of the time you guys gave for us. And somebody also wanted you to know that the tunnel entrance is beautiful.
We think so too. Thank you.
So one of the things we hope that everyone at the end of our Roebling road trip program, once we've, shown you guys a little bit about every single Roebling site in America and beyond, we'll all go on a road trip in real life once Corona's finished. And I was really glad to see Elizabeth sort of showed us every other park that's over in that area, so we can all take the 5-hour trip from Roebling, New Jersey to go out and meet you guys in person. So thanks again for presenting today, and thanks everybody for participating and asking so many great questions. And for having a Roebling mug. All right, bye everybody.
Thank you very much.